You can't even remember which end of a screwdriver to hold anymore, Dad. You really think the bank's going to trust you with 40 years of savings? Marcus said it flat, almost bored, the way a man reads a grocery list. And he said it in front of the admissions clerk, in front of the security guard by the sliding doors, in front of me. The fluorescent light overhead kept its steady electric hum. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted their weight. The wheelchair a young man had been pushing toward the elevator stopped squeaking mid-roll, its wheel frozen against the linoleum, as if the whole building had simply forgotten how to move. The admissions clerk's pen hovered over her clipboard, the tip not quite touching the paper, waiting to see whether the room was going to survive what had just been said in it. I had spent 41 years building things that were meant to keep people safe on the inside and keep trouble on the outside. Door locks, window latches, the small mechanical hearts of safes that families trusted with the things they couldn't bear to lose. I understood, better than almost anyone alive, the exact moment a well-made mechanism gives way. There's no drama in it, no grinding, no sparks, just a quiet click, and then nothing holds anymore. That's what my son's voice sounded like. A key that had been filed down so many times, on so many different men, that it no longer fit any lock in the house I'd built for our family, and he didn't even seem to notice the door had already closed behind him. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 63 years old. For 4 decades, I ran a small locksmith and antique restoration shop on Birch Street in Cedar Falls, the kind of shop where people bring in their grandfather's pocket watch or their grandmother's jewelry box with a drawer that's been stuck since Eisenhower was president, and you take your time with it because some things deserve to be opened gently. I paid off Marcus's culinary school tuition, $22,000, back when he still wanted to be a chef instead of a man who talked about portfolios. I co-signed the loan on his first restaurant, $110,000, and I never once asked him to pay me back. When the restaurant folded 8 years later, I didn't say a word about the money. I just handed him the keys to my truck and told him to start over. I'm telling you the numbers because numbers are the only part of this story nobody can twist. Everything else, my mind, my memory, my competence, that part, my own son decided he was going to twist for me. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. And if you've ever had someone who was supposed to protect you decide instead that you were an obstacle, hit that like button and subscribe because this story is for you. 5 months before that morning in the admissions lobby, my wife Eleanor died in the armchair by our bedroom window, the one that caught the 7 o'clock light every morning of our marriage. Her heart, weakened by 2 years of illness we'd fought together with more grace than either of us knew we had, simply stopped while she was reading. I found her with her glasses still on and a paperback open on her lap, page 140, and for the rest of my life that number will mean something only I understand. I want to tell you, I handled the grief well. I didn't. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after 40 years of 2 voices, and I never learned to survive it. I stopped answering the bell over the shop door, because the sound of it used to mean Eleanor was bringing me coffee at 11, and some mornings I'd hear that little brass jingle in memory and have to sit down on my stool until my hands stopped shaking. I never once told anyone that. I didn't tell Marcus. I didn't tell the girl who used to help me at the register on Saturdays. Grief, I learned, is a lock with no visible keyhole. You can spend your whole life running your fingers along the seam, looking for a way in, and some days you simply don't find one. I tell you this now, before anything else, because I want you to understand something plainly. I was not the invincible old man in this story. I was a grieving widower who avoided his own wife's sewing box for 5 months because he couldn't trust his hands not to break something delicate. Whatever strength shows up later in this story, it came after that weakness, not instead of it. I didn't know it yet, but while I was learning to survive an empty house, my son was learning to survive something far more dangerous. The collapsing weight of a business he'd built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Marcus had started a boutique property renovation company 2 years earlier, flipping old houses in the historic district, the kind of business that looks glamorous in photographs and bleeds cash behind the scenes. I didn't know, not then, how deep the bleeding had gotten. I didn't know about the private loans, the kind that don't come with a bank's letterhead or a bank's patience. I didn't know that Cheryl, his wife, had quietly shuttered her own boutique clothing store 11 months earlier after running through nearly $90,000 trying to keep it alive, and had told almost no one, including, I would later learn, including Marcus himself, for the better part of a year. What I did notice in the weeks after Eleanor's funeral was that my son started visiting more. He brought groceries I hadn't asked for. He asked gently, almost tenderly, whether I was sleeping all right, whether I was eating, whether I ever felt confused about the day of the week. I thought it was love. God help me, for the first few weeks I let myself believe it was love. Then came the incidents. The first was small enough that I nearly forgot it happened. I misplaced the keys to the shop, actual physical keys, the irony of which is not lost on me, and searched the house for 2 frantic hours before finding them exactly where Marcus had helped me put them the day before, inside the flour canister in the pantry. He apologized profusely. Said he must have been distracted. I believed him. The second incident happened at his daughter's birthday party, in front of nearly 30 guests. I walked into the backyard and, for one disorienting moment, genuinely could not remember which of the children playing near the pool was my own granddaughter. It was 8-year-old Lily, of course. She ran up and hugged my leg before I'd even finished scanning the yard. But for that one moment, standing there blinking in the afternoon sun, I felt a cold, unfamiliar panic. I didn't know, not then, that the lemonade I'd been handed 20 minutes earlier had come from a pitcher Cheryl had mixed herself, and that my usual evening dose of the mild sleep aid Dr. Grantham had prescribed me after Eleanor's death, one small tablet meant for 10 p.m., had somehow found its way into that pitcher at 2 in the afternoon. I didn't know it yet, but I was not losing my mind. I was being carefully, patiently, deliberately confused, one afternoon at a time, by 2 people who had run the numbers on my estate and discovered that a man who is merely grieving cannot be controlled, but a man who is declared incompetent can be. The third incident was the one that mattered. I fell asleep at the wheel of my own truck, 3 blocks from my house, at 4 in the afternoon, and drifted gently into a parked car outside the pharmacy. No one was hurt. The damage to both vehicles was minor, but there is nothing minor about a police report that lists your name, your age, and the word disoriented in an officer's careful handwriting. Marcus was at my house within the hour, holding my hand, telling me it was going to be all right, telling me he loved me, and I believed every word of it, because a man doesn't expect his own son to have engineered the very afternoon that would be used against him. Dr. Grantham examined me 4 days later. I remember the appointment clearly. Too clearly, in fact, for a man who was supposedly slipping. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, and I did it without hesitation. He asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 past 11, and I drew it correctly, the way I'd drawn 1,000 clock faces in my restoration work. And yet the report that reached the county courthouse 2 weeks later described significant cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia and a documented pattern of confusion and risk to personal safety. I have read that report more times than I can count since then, hunting for the moment where the truth slipped out of it, and I have never found it, because the truth was never in it to begin with. I want to be honest about something else, something I've had a long time to sit with in a small room with a locked door. I should have asked Marcus directly and plainly how his business was doing months before any of this began. I saw the signs, the tension in his shoulders at Sunday dinner, the way he flinched when his phone buzzed, the new watch he wore that didn't match the car he was still making payments on. I saw all of it, and I said nothing, because Eleanor and I had raised him to be a man who solved his own problems, and some prideful, foolish part of me didn't want to embarrass him by asking. My silence didn't cause what happened to me, but it left a door unlocked that a more careful father might have bolted shut in time. The guardianship hearing took 11 minutes. I want you to sit with that number because I have sat with it for a long time. 11 minutes to decide that a man who had run his own business for 4 decades, filed his own taxes, restored antique clocks down to the last brass gear, could no longer be trusted to manage his own bank account. Dr. Grantham's report was entered into evidence. The police report from the fender bender was entered into evidence. Cheryl testified, her voice trembling with what I can only assume was very well-rehearsed sorrow, about how frightened she'd been watching me fade. Marcus testified that he loved me too much to watch me get hurt, that this was the hardest decision of his life, that all he wanted was to protect me. The judge, a tired man near the end of a long docket, granted emergency temporary guardianship to my son, effective immediately, with a full review hearing scheduled in 23 days. 23 days. I remembered doing the math in my head, sitting in that courtroom in a chair too hard for a man my age, and understanding with a cold, sinking clarity that in 23 days, if nothing changed, this would stop being temporary. My accounts, my house, my late wife's trust, the small fortune we'd built together, one repaired lock and one restored clock at a time, all of it would pass, permanently and legally, into my son's hands, and I would have no more say over any of it than a child. They didn't take me home that afternoon. They took me to Golden Meadows Memory Care, a low brick building on the edge of town with hanging flower baskets by the entrance, and a security system on the doors that I recognized, with a bitter, professional pride, as one of my own company's older commercial installations, a lock I myself had once sold to keep danger out, now being used to keep me in. Marcus carried my suitcase. He wouldn't meet my eyes in the parking lot. For one brief foolish second, watching his jaw tighten and his hand tremble slightly on the suitcase handle, I let myself hope that some part of him understood what he was doing, that some part of him might still turn back. Then Cheryl touched his elbow, murmured something too quiet for me to hear, and whatever had flickered in his face went dark again, like a switch thrown in another room. The admissions lobby was where I heard the words about the screwdriver. It was where the wheelchair stopped squeaking, and the clerk's pen hovered mid-air, and the whole overlit room seemed to hold its breath around the sound of a son deciding, out loud, in front of strangers, that his father had become an old key filed down to nothing. I didn't know it yet, but standing 8 feet away from me, at that admissions desk, half listening while she reviewed another resident's chart, was a 29-year-old night nurse named Maya Torres, and something about the way I answered Marcus, quietly, without flinching, my hands steady on the arms of my chair, made her look up from the clipboard and study my face for one long second too many. They gave me a room at the end of a beige hallway that smelled faintly of lavender air freshener and industrial cleaner, a room with a hospital bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking a modest garden where a few residents sat in the afternoon sun. It was smaller than my workshop's back office. It felt, in every sense that mattered, like a cell with better lighting. 2 days later, Marcus and Cheryl arrived with a delivery van and an apology in their eyes that didn't reach their voices. They'd brought me, they said, something to make the room feel more like home. 2 orderlies carried it in together, grunting under its weight. Eleanor's writing desk, the antique mahogany secretary that had belonged to her grandmother, the one I had restored with my own hands 30 years earlier, replacing 2 hinges and re-gluing a warped drawer, and, in a quiet Sunday afternoon that Eleanor never knew about, building into its base a shallow false-bottomed compartment, the kind of small private secret a locksmith gives the woman he loves, so she'll always have one drawer in the world that belongs only to her. I stared at that desk being wheeled into my narrow room and felt something twist painfully behind my ribs. Grief and suspicion tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate one from the other. Marcus told me, not quite looking at me, that he thought it would bring me comfort. Cheryl said it would help me feel less confused, less far from home. I thanked them. I even meant it. In the small, broken way a grieving man can mean anything in a room he didn't choose. What none of us understood in that moment, not Marcus, not Cheryl, not even me, was that Eleanor had used that hidden compartment one final time in the last month of her life, and that the man who had built it with his own hands had been too consumed by loss for 5 straight months to remember it existed. It would take someone outside our family, someone with no history in that house and no grief clouding her eyes, to notice that one drawer in that old desk sat exactly 6 millimeters higher than it should. Maya Torres had worked the overnight shift at Golden Meadows for 3 years, long enough to develop the particular instinct that good nurses carry like a second pulse, the sense that something in a room is slightly wrong before the chart or the monitor can tell you why. She'd grown up watching her own grandmother slide gradually and honestly into dementia, watched the real thing happen slowly and unmistakably over 6 patient years, and something about the speed and shape of my file didn't match anything she'd seen in that long apprenticeship of love and loss. I didn't know any of this yet. What I knew in my first week at Golden Meadows was the particular humiliation of being spoken to slowly, as though grief and 41 years of fine mechanical work had somehow erased my vocabulary along with my freedom. An aide asked me, gently, if I remembered my own last name. Another asked if I knew what year it was. I answered every question correctly, calmly, without a flicker of hesitation, and watched each answer get written down in a chart that had already decided, before I opened my mouth, what kind of man I was. There is a particular skill a locksmith develops without ever meaning to, the ability to sit very still and watch a mechanism from the outside, cataloging every small movement, waiting for the one flaw that will let you in. I had spent 4 decades using that skill on brass and steel. Now, sitting in a beige room that wasn't mine, I began using it on the people who came and went through my door. I noticed that the medication cart that visited my room every evening included a small paper cup with 2 pills in it, though Dr. Grantham's original prescription, the one I remembered signing off on months earlier, had called for one. I noticed that Cheryl visited twice that first week, always alone, always with a manila folder, always asking me to sign something, just a formality, Walter, nothing to worry about, in a tone so practiced it had clearly been used on other old men before me. I signed nothing. I told her each time that my hands were too tired that day, that I'd rather wait until Marcus could explain it to me properly, and I watched, with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who has just found the flaw in someone else's mechanism, her composure crack for 1/2 second before she smiled and said, of course, another time. I hadn't planned any of it. I want to be honest with you about that. I wasn't executing some brilliant strategy in those first days. I was a frightened, grieving old man doing the only thing he knew how to do, watching carefully and saying less than he was thinking. It was on the 9th night, close to 11 o'clock, that Maya knocked softly on my doorframe and asked if she could come in to check my blood pressure, though we both understood by then that it wasn't really about the blood pressure. She was quiet while she worked, the cuff tightening and releasing around my arm, and then, almost as an afterthought, she nodded toward Eleanor's writing desk sitting against the far wall. That's a beautiful piece, she said. My grandfather had one almost like it. The drawers on these old secretaries are never quite even, are they? This one here. She tapped the second drawer from the bottom, lightly. The way you'd knock on a door you weren't sure you were allowed to open. Sits about a 1/4 inch proud of the others. I noticed it the first day they brought it in. Figured it was just old wood settling. I felt something go very still and very cold inside my chest. The particular stillness of a man realizing, all at once, that the thing he had been too broken to remember had been sitting 6 feet from his bed for 9 straight nights. It's not settling, I said quietly. I built that compartment myself 30 years ago. Maya's hands paused on the blood pressure cuff. She looked at me, really looked, the way almost no one at Golden Meadows had looked at me since the day I arrived. And something passed between us that had nothing to do with charts or medications or the 23-day clock ticking somewhere far outside that room. Do you want me to open it? She asked. Or would you rather I called someone? There's no one to call, I told her, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. My voice cracked on a sentence that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying possibility of hope. Please, open it. She knelt in front of the desk, and I watched her fingers find the seam I had cut myself 3 decades earlier, watched her press in the precise spot, just beside the left runner, where the grain of the wood hit a hairline gap no eye could find without knowing to look, and felt the small mechanical click travel up through the desk and into my own chest like a second heartbeat. The false bottom lifted 1.5 inches, Inside, resting on a bed of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years, was a single envelope, cream-colored, gone soft and slightly yellow at the edges, with my name written across the front in Eleanor's unmistakable hand. The same careful looping script she'd used on every grocery list and birthday card for 40 years. I didn't know it yet, but the last time that drawer had opened, Eleanor had been alone in the house, 4 weeks before she died, sitting at that desk in the 7 o'clock light she loved, writing to a husband she was afraid might one day need to hear from her when she could no longer say it out loud. My hands were shaking so badly that Maya had to help me open it. I want you to understand what it means for a man who spent his life opening things, locks, safes, the delicate hinge backs of pocket watches, to sit helpless while someone else opens the one thing he cannot bear to fumble. She slid the letter free and placed it gently in my palms, and then, instead of going back to her chart and her rounds and the dozen other patients waiting for her down that beige hallway, she pulled the room's single chair close to my bed and sat down beside me in silence, the way you sit with someone at a hospital bedside, and waited. "My dearest Walter," the letter began, and I had to stop there for nearly a minute, my thumb pressed against the ink, before I could make myself read further. "I'm writing this on a Tuesday while you're at the shop because I don't think I could say these words to your face without watching you try to make me feel better about them, and I don't want to be made to feel better right now. I want to be honest. I've been worried about Marcus for almost a year. I haven't told you, because you carry his failures harder than you carry your own, and I didn't want to add weight to shoulders that already ache by 6 o'clock every evening. But I saw something last month, when I stopped by his office to drop off Lily's birthday present, that I haven't been able to put out of my mind since." A stack of letters on his desk, from a lender I didn't recognize, the kind of letterhead that doesn't belong to any bank we've ever done business with. He put his arm over them before I could read more than the top line, and laughed it off, and I let him, because that's what mothers do when they're afraid of the answer. "I'm not writing this because I know something terrible is going to happen. I don't. I'm writing it because I'm frightened in a smaller, quieter way, frightened that our son has let money become a kind of pressure he can't tell either of us about, and frightened of what a man does when pressure like that goes on long enough unspoken. I've watched love curdle into control before, in other families, in ways that started small and reasonable and ended somewhere none of us would have believed at the start. If you're reading this, Walter, it's because something has happened that made you need to hear it, and I'm sorry I'm not there to say it out loud instead. Whatever it is, please don't let anyone convince you that loving someone means handing them the keys to everything you built. You taught me that a lock only means something if the person holding the key has earned your trust one honest day at a time. Don't forget your own lesson, my love. Just because the hand asking for the key belongs to our son. I don't know what's coming. I only know I'd rather you have this and never need it than need it and not have it. I love you more than I ever learned how to say out loud. Look after yourself. Look after the shop. And if it ever comes to it, look in the ledger under the false floor of your workbench. I found something there I didn't understand, and I copied down what I could before I lost my nerve to keep looking. Yours, always. Eleanor." I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time. Maya didn't say anything. She didn't ask me what it meant, didn't reach for her clipboard, didn't do any of the small professional things that would have turned that moment back into a shift at work instead of what it actually was. Two strangers sitting together in the wreckage of a marriage that had loved carefully enough to leave a warning behind, even when it couldn't leave much else. "She knew," I finally said, my voice raw. "She knew something was wrong with Marcus months before she died, and she never told me, because she didn't want to hurt me before she had to." "She was trying to protect you," Maya said quietly. "It sounds like she spent a long time being careful about how she loved people." I looked up at her then, really looked, and asked the question I'd been too proud and too frightened to ask anyone in 9 days. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You could lose your job for what you just did." Maya was quiet for a moment, turning the blood pressure cuff over in her hands. My grandmother spent the last 2 years of her life in a place like this, she finally said. A good place, mostly, with good people. But there was one aide, near the end, who used to talk to her like she was already gone, even on her good days, even when she was sharper than half the staff. I promised myself, when I became a nurse, that I'd never do that to somebody. And Mr. Hensley, you don't talk like a man who's lost anything except his freedom. I want to tell you that I immediately understood the full shape of what my son had done to me. I didn't. Grief and confinement had worn a groove of doubt into me deep enough that some small, exhausted part of my mind still wondered whether Eleanor's letter was simply the anxious worry of a dying woman, whether I was building a conspiracy out of a mother's ordinary fears. It was Maya, in the end, who asked the question that cracked that last piece of doubt open. "Mr. Hensley," she said carefully, "has anyone actually evaluated you honestly since you got here? Because I've read your chart, and I've watched you for 9 nights, and I don't think the man in that chart is the man in this room." I told her, then, everything: the flour canister, the lemonade at Lily's birthday party, the sedative dose that had somehow doubled itself in a paper cup for 8 straight nights. I told her about Cheryl's Manila folder and the papers I kept refusing to sign. I told her about the 23-day clock ticking somewhere in a courthouse I couldn't reach from a locked memory care wing. When I finished, Maya sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Her jaw set in a way that told me something had shifted in her, something professional and something personal both at once. "I'm a mandated reporter," she said slowly. "By law, if I have reasonable suspicion of elder abuse or neglect, I'm required to report it to Adult Protective Services and to the State Nursing Board if a physician's conduct is involved. I can't investigate this myself, Mr. Hensley. I'm not a detective and I'm not a lawyer. But I can file a report tonight based on what I've observed in this chart and in this room, and that report opens a door nobody in your family can close again just by signing another form. Do it," I said. And for the first time in 5 months, I felt something that wasn't grief or fear. It felt absurdly like hope, small and sharp as the first click of a tumbler falling into place. But a report alone, Maya cautioned me, wouldn't be enough on its own, not against a signed physician's evaluation, not against a court order already granted. It would open an investigation, but investigations take time, and I had 23 days, now 19, before that emergency guardianship became permanent and unbreakable. What I needed, she said, was something concrete. Something a judge couldn't argue away as one nurse's opinion against a doctor's signature. I thought about Eleanor's letter, still trembling in my hands, and the line I'd read 3 times already without quite letting myself believe it. "Look in the ledger under the false floor of your workbench." I hadn't been back to my shop since the day of the guardianship hearing. Marcus had a key now, along with everything else that used to be mine. But there was one person left in Cedar Falls who also had a key to that shop, who had worked beside me at that very workbench for 11 years before retiring, and who owed me exactly nothing except the kind of loyalty that doesn't get erased by a court order. His name was Sam Okafor, 68 years old, my old apprentice, and for the last decade of my working life, the closest thing I had to a business partner. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. I asked Maya, my hands still shaking around the edges of Eleanor's letter, whether there was a phone I could use, a landline, something that wouldn't show up as an unauthorized call on whatever monitoring system Marcus had put in place around me. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "There's a phone in the nurse's station. I'm not supposed to let residents use it outside of family contact hours." She looked at me for a long second, weighing something I recognized instantly, because I'd spent a lifetime watching people weigh exactly that same calculation before deciding to trust a stranger with something that mattered. "But I think tonight we're going to make an exception." Sam answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep, and then within seconds, sharp with alarm once he understood who was calling him from a memory care facility at nearly midnight. I told him everything, as briefly and as calmly as I could manage, and I heard, on the other end of the line, the particular silence of an old friend doing the same math I'd done in that courtroom 11 days earlier. "They told me you'd gone downhill fast," Sam said finally. his voice tight with something between fury and disbelief. Marcus said it himself at the funeral reception, told half the room you were struggling. I thought, Walter, I'm sorry, I thought it was just grief. It was grief, I said. Just not the kind he told everyone it was. I asked him for one thing. The shop key was still legally his. I'd never taken him off the lease when he retired. A small kindness from years earlier that had turned, without either of us knowing it, into the one loose thread Marcus's lawyers had failed to account for. I asked Sam to go to the shop that night if he could manage it and check the workbench in the back office. The one with the reinforced steel legs I'd installed myself for stability. The one only 2 people alive knew had a false floor built into its base. He called back 40 minutes later, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never once heard in 11 years of working beside him. Walter, he said, I found it. A ledger, handwritten, your wife's hand, going back almost a year. Dates, dollar amounts, names of lenders I've never heard of. And Walter, there's a page in here where she's copied out what looks like your signature, next to a note that says, this isn't his handwriting. I checked it against the anniversary card he gave me in April. I think she found forged documents, Walter. I think she found them, and she was building a case, quietly, the same way you'd trace a fault line through a bad lock. One small piece at a time. I sat in the nurse's station at Golden Meadows Memory Care, holding a phone with hands that had steadied, finally, into something resembling their old certainty, and felt the last piece of doubt I'd been carrying since the guardianship hearing fall away completely. Eleanor hadn't just been frightened for our son. In the last weeks of her life, quietly, without telling either of us, she had been investigating him, and somewhere in that ledger, in her own careful handwriting, was the beginning of the very evidence that could unlock the door my son had spent 5 months building to keep me behind. I didn't know it yet, but 19 days was going to be enough time. I didn't know it yet, but the woman who would help me prove it wasn't a private investigator or a hired lawyer. She was a 29-year-old night nurse who had simply refused to let an old man be spoken to like he was already gone. What I did know, sitting in that quiet nurse's station with Eleanor's letter still warm from my own hands, was that the man my son had walked into Golden Meadows 9 days ago, slow, compliant, grieving, easy to dismiss, was not the man who was going to walk back out. The next morning brought a version of daylight I hadn't felt in 9 days. Not brighter exactly, but heavier with purpose. The particular clarity that comes when a man who has spent months being told he can't trust his own mind wakes up holding proof that he can. Maya came on shift at 7, her eyes shadowed from the overnight hours but sharp, and found me already sitting up in the chair by the window. Eleanor's letter folded carefully into the inside pocket of the cardigan. Marcus had brought me close against my chest where I could feel the shape of it whenever doubt tried to creep back in. I filed the report last night, she told me quietly, checking the hallway before she spoke. Adult Protective Services has 48 hours to acknowledge a case involving suspected medication tampering and forced institutionalization. I also flagged the chart discrepancies to my supervisor this morning, the dosage increase on your sedative that isn't documented anywhere in your physician's orders. That alone is a licensing problem for Dr. Grantham, whether or not it connects to anything else. I want to explain something about the version of myself that showed up in the days that followed, because it would be easy for you to picture some sudden transformation, the mild-mannered locksmith throwing off his cardigan and becoming a man of steel overnight. That isn't what happened, and I don't want to lie to you about it. I was still frightened. I still woke some mornings forgetting, for one terrible half-second, that Eleanor wasn't in the next room, and had to lie there letting the grief resettle over me like a blanket before I could make myself get up. What changed wasn't the fear. What changed was that, for the first time since her funeral, the fear had somewhere useful to go. I had one advantage Marcus hadn't accounted for, because he'd never bothered, in 35 years of being my son, to fully understand what I actually did for a living. People think a locksmith's skill is in opening things. The real skill, the one that pays the bills over 4 decades, is in understanding exactly how a system is built to fail, where the weak pins are, where a manufacturer cut corners, where a mechanism that looks solid from the outside is actually held together by a single overworked spring. I had spent my whole professional life reading structures for their hidden weaknesses. I intended to read my son's scheme the same way. The name on the top of Eleanor's ledger, the one that appeared most often beside dollar figures I didn't recognize, was a company called Brightline Capital Partners. I didn't know the name, but Sam, reading through the pages over the phone that second night, recognized something about the letterhead, a private lending outfit that had 2 years earlier financed a renovation project for another contractor in town, a man named Ray Delgado, who Sam happened to know from the hardware supply house they both used. I called Ray myself the following evening, from the same borrowed phone at the nurse's station, and told him honestly who I was and what I was trying to understand. I want to note something here, because it matters. I didn't ask Ray to break into anything, to hack anything, to hand over anything he didn't already have the right to share. I simply asked him what he knew about Brightline Capital Partners, as one small businessman asking another about a lender they might have both crossed paths with. Ray was quiet for a moment, and then he told me something that made the floor of that quiet nurse's station feel a little less steady beneath me. Brightline wasn't a bank. It wasn't even, strictly speaking, legal in the way most people think of lending, a private high-interest outfit that specialized in loans to contractors who couldn't get financing anywhere else, the kind of lender who didn't send polite letters when payments were missed. Ray had gotten out from under them 2 years earlier, at considerable cost, and he still flinched, he admitted, whenever an unfamiliar number called his phone. "Your son's mixed up with Brightline?" Ray asked, and I could hear the old weary sympathy of a man who'd survived the same fire. "Walter, I'm sorry. That's not a debt you talk your way out of. That's a debt you either pay, or you find someone, to hand them instead." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. Someone to hand them instead. I thought of my own accounts, my house, Eleanor's trust, assets that in 19 days, minus the 4 that had already passed, would become fully and legally my son's to do with as he pleased. The public records search Diane Castellano ran 2 days later confirmed what Ray's warning had already told me in plainer language. Diane had been Eleanor's and my estate attorney for 11 years, a sharp, unhurried woman in her 50s who had, in a single phone call from the Golden Meadows courtyard, arranged quietly by Maya during an approved outdoor visitation hour, gone from stunned disbelief to controlled, focused fury, faster than I'd ever seen a lawyer move. "I should have caught this at the hearing," she told me, sitting across from me at a picnic table in the memory care garden, a folder of documents between us that Maya had discreetly made sure no orderly interrupted. I wasn't notified of the emergency petition until after it was granted. That's not uncommon with emergency guardianships, but it means nobody who actually knew you, Walter, was in that courtroom to tell the judge what I'm looking at right now. What she was looking at, she explained, was entirely public information, filed liens against Marcus's renovation company, 3 of them in the past 14 months, along with a county business court filing showing the company had defaulted on a commercial line of credit 6 months earlier. None of it had come from hacking, from private investigators breaking into anyone's accounts, from anything but the ordinary public paper trail that any citizen has the right to search. Diane had simply known, better than I did, where to look. "This tells us your son is drowning financially," she said. "It doesn't on its own tell us he committed fraud against you. For that, we need the ledger your wife kept, and we need someone with medical authority to say plainly, on the record, that Dr. Grantham's evaluation doesn't hold up." That second piece arrived 3 days later, and it arrived, fittingly, through the exact institution that had been used against me. Maya's report to Adult Protective Services had triggered, as she'd promised it would, a formal case review, and as part of that review, a second independent neuropsychological evaluation was ordered, conducted by a geriatric specialist from the county hospital who had no relationship whatsoever to Marcus, to Cheryl, or to Golden Meadows. I remember that evaluation more clearly than almost anything else from those 19 days, because it was the first time in 5 months that anyone in a position of authority looked at me and simply listened. Dr. Anita Prasad spent nearly 2 hours with me, memory tests, reasoning tests, long stretches of ordinary conversation about my shop, my marriage, the small mechanical puzzles I'd spent a lifetime solving, and at the end of it, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at myself since before Eleanor died. Professional respect. Mr. Hensley, she said, I want to be direct with you, because I think you've earned directness after everything you've described to me. There is no clinical evidence here of dementia, of significant cognitive impairment, or of any condition that would justify guardianship. Whatever's documented in Dr. Grantham's file, it doesn't match the man in this room. Her formal report, filed with both Adult Protective Services and the County Probate Court, became the second piece of the case Diane was building. The third piece, the one that would ultimately matter more than either of us understood at the time, came not from any investigation I initiated, but from a phone call Diane received 4 days before the guardianship review hearing, a call from a nurse practitioner named Renata Volkov, who had worked alongside Dr. Grantham for 6 years and had, apparently, been quietly troubled by something in his practice for nearly as long. Renata didn't come forward because anyone asked her to. She came forward, Diane told me, because she'd heard through a mutual colleague that a formal complaint had been filed against Dr. Grantham with the state medical board, and once one thread had been pulled, she found she could no longer stay silent about the others she'd noticed over the years. Evaluations that seemed to arrive at predetermined conclusions, family members who visited the office more often than the actual patients, a pattern she'd never had proof enough to report on her own, but that now, with an active investigation already underway, she felt an obligation to describe. What she described, in a signed statement to the medical board, was a physician who had, on at least 2 prior occasions that she was aware of, produced cognitive evaluations that conveniently supported a family member's petition for guardianship. Evaluations that did not match her own informal observations of the patients in question. She couldn't say, under oath, that Dr. Grantham had been paid to falsify my file, but she could say, and did say, that the pattern troubled her enough to finally speak. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the 2 weeks that followed my transfer to Golden Meadows, a second front had opened in this fight without my ever setting foot in it. A slow, careful unraveling conducted entirely through legitimate channels, through mandated reporters and licensing boards and public records, by people who had never met me, but who refused to look away once they'd been shown where to look. I want to pause the story here to tell you something about my son that isn't easy to say, because even now, even after everything, some old and stubborn part of me still wants to protect him from it. In the second week of my confinement, Marcus visited alone, without Cheryl, on a Thursday afternoon that I remember for how strange it felt. The first time in nearly a month that I'd seen something on his face that wasn't performance. He sat across from me in the garden, turning his wedding ring around his finger the way he'd done as a nervous boy waiting outside the principal's office, and for almost 5 full minutes he didn't say anything at all. "Dad," he finally said, "I need you to know something. I never wanted this to go this far. I studied him carefully, the way I'd studied 1,000 locks in my life, looking for the tell that would show me whether the mechanism in front of me was solid or hollow. How far did you want it to go?" "Marcus?" He flinched at the question, and for one unguarded moment, something raw moved across his face. Guilt, or something close enough to it that I nearly reached across the table toward him, the old paternal reflex still alive under everything he'd done to me. "The loans," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It got bigger than I could handle, faster than I understood. Cheryl said there was a way to fix it without anyone getting hurt. That it was just paperwork, that you'd be taken care of, that this was temporary, that... He stopped himself, as though he'd heard, only after the words left his mouth, how thin they sounded out loud. "Cheryl said," I repeated quietly. "Marcus, whose idea was this? All of it. From the beginning." He didn't answer me. He looked down at his hands, at the ring still turning between his fingers, and something in his silence told me more than any confession could have. That whatever guilt was sitting in my son's chest that afternoon, it wasn't guilt over a plan he'd built alone. It was the guilt of a man realizing, slowly and too late, that he'd become a passenger in something much larger than the small, desperate lie he'd first agreed to tell. I didn't press him further that day. I let him leave with his silence intact, because some part of me, the part that had spent 40 years being patient with broken things, waiting for the right moment before applying pressure, understood that a man that close to breaking doesn't need to be pushed. He needs to be given room to fall on his own. It was Diane, 3 days later, going through the last of the public filings connected to Brightline Capital Partners, who found the thread that finally made sense of everything Marcus hadn't said in that garden. Buried in a county business registration filing, updated 8 months earlier, was a change of registered agent for a shell company called Meridian Fine Goods LLC, a name that meant nothing to me until Diane pointed out its listed address, a boutique clothing storefront on Elm Street that had closed. According to public commercial lease records, nearly a year before Marcus's own company began missing payments to Brightline. The boutique had belonged to Cheryl. "I think your daughter-in-law's business didn't just fail quietly, Walter," Diane said, laying the documents out across the picnic table with the careful precision of a woman assembling a case she intended to win. "I think it failed under nearly $100,000 of debt she never told your son about. Debt she may have been managing, quietly, through Brightline, for the better part of 2 years before your wife ever wrote that letter. I think when Marcus's own company started struggling, Cheryl already had a relationship with people who don't forgive debt, and I think she knew exactly what kind of pressure that relationship could apply to a husband who trusted her." I sat very still, feeling something shift into place with the particular click of a tumbler falling exactly where it was designed to fall. Eleanor's letter had warned me to watch what money pressure does to love. She hadn't been wrong about the direction of the danger. She'd simply, in the last weeks of her life, been looking at the wrong half of the marriage. Marcus, I understood now, hadn't orchestrated my confinement out of pure calculated greed. He'd been drowning in a debt his own wife had helped create and then hidden from him, drowning in a fear she had quietly, patiently, expertly redirected toward the one source of money large enough to save them both, his own father's estate. He was guilty. I want to be clear about that. Nothing excuses what he did to me, the drugged lemonade, the staged incidents, the 11 minutes in a courtroom that nearly cost me everything. But he had not been the architect of his own cruelty. He had been, in the truest and saddest sense of the word, used. Diane's investigation turned up one more detail in those final days before the review hearing, a detail that would matter enormously once the truth finally came out in public. Dr. Grantham, it turned out, had personal financial ties of his own to Brightline Capital Partners, a private loan, taken out 18 months earlier for what his own bankruptcy filing later described as medical practice expansion costs, a loan that, according to the timeline Diane assembled, had been quietly forgiven in full 4 months after he signed the evaluation that declared me incompetent. 9 days remained until the guardianship review hearing when Diane laid the full picture out for me across that picnic table: the ledger, the liens, Renata's statement, Cheryl's hidden boutique debt, Dr. Grantham's forgiven loan. It was, she told me, more than enough to challenge the guardianship in court. Probably more than enough to see charges filed for elder financial abuse, for fraud, possibly for conspiracy, depending on what prosecutors chose to pursue. But a courtroom victory, quiet and procedural, wasn't the ending I found myself wanting, sitting in that garden with Eleanor's letter still folded against my chest. Marcus had humiliated me in front of strangers in an admissions lobby, had called me a filed-down key in front of a room full of people who would carry that image of me for weeks. Cheryl had smiled at me over a manila folder for 9 straight days, while quietly financing her own rescue with my family's future. I thought about the invitation that had arrived at Golden Meadows 3 days earlier, forwarded to me by an aide who assumed, correctly, that a family member had requested I receive it. A glossy card announcing the facility's annual Family Champions Gala, held each spring to honor relatives whose devotion to residents exemplified the very best of caregiving. This year's honoree, printed in careful calligraphy beneath a photograph I recognized instantly, was Marcus Hensley, being celebrated for his tireless commitment to his father's well-being. I sat with that invitation in my lap for a long time, feeling something cold and clear settle over the last of my grief, the way frost settles over a window at the end of a long autumn. I didn't know it yet, but in 6 days, in a ballroom full of donors and families and reporters from the local paper, my son was going to stand up in front of everyone he'd spent months lying to and accept an award for saving my life. The 6 days before the gala passed the way the final turns of a stubborn lock sometimes do, slow, resistant, and then all at once. Diane filed an emergency motion for expedited review with the probate court, attaching Dr. Prasad's independent evaluation, Renata's sworn statement, and a summary of the public financial records connecting Marcus's company, Cheryl's Shuttered Boutique, and Brightline Capital Partners. The judge, the same tired man who had granted the guardianship in 11 rushed minutes, agreed to hear the full case on the Monday following the gala, 4 days after Marcus was scheduled to stand on a small stage and accept an award for devotion he had never actually shown me. Adult Protective Services, meanwhile, moved with a speed I hadn't expected from anything wearing the label of government bureaucracy. A caseworker named Priya Anand visited me twice that week, quiet and thorough, cross-referencing the medication logs Maya had flagged against the pharmacy's own dispensing records, confirming what we already suspected, that someone with access to my chart had been authorizing a dosage that no physician had ever actually signed off on. By Thursday, county sheriff's detectives specializing in elder financial abuse had opened a formal case file alongside the civil guardianship review, the two investigations running on parallel tracks toward the same Monday. I want to explain why I decided not to wait quietly for Monday's hearing, why I chose instead to walk into that ballroom on Saturday night. Diane advised against it, gently but firmly, worried that anything unpredictable might complicate a case she was building with careful precision. Maya, off duty that evening but present anyway, in a plain dark dress instead of scrubs, told me she understood either way, whatever I chose. But I had spent 5 months being spoken over, spoken about, and spoken for, in a courtroom, in a doctor's office, in an admissions lobby with a squeaking wheelchair frozen mid-roll. Eleanor's letter sat folded in my breast pocket, and somewhere underneath the careful legal strategy Diane had built, a simpler, older need was still alive in me, the need to stand in the same room as the people who had tried to erase me and let them watch me fail to disappear. Diane came with me, along with Detective Rosa Ibarra from the County Elder Abuse Unit, both of them present not to stage a dramatic arrest in front of 300 strangers, but simply, quietly, to be witnesses, and, if things unfolded the way the evidence suggested they might, to be close enough to act on what was already, by Saturday evening, an active warrant for Cheryl Hensley's arrest on charges of financial fraud, connected not to my case directly but to a separate investigation. Brightline's own collapse had triggered 2 counties over, one that had been building for months before I ever became part of it. The Cedar Falls Grand Hotel ballroom was lit gold that night, round tables draped in white linen, a string quartet playing something soft near the entrance, donors and administrators and family members in evening wear, clustered in easy, self-satisfied conversation. I stood at the edge of it in a suit I hadn't worn since Eleanor's funeral, feeling the particular vertigo of a man walking back into a world that had, 4 weeks earlier, decided he no longer belonged in it. Marcus saw me first. I watched the champagne glass nearly slip from his hand, watched the color drain from his face in real time, the practiced ease he'd worn all evening cracking open like a poorly tempered lock finally meeting the wrong key. Cheryl, beside him in a deep red gown, followed his gaze and went very still. "Dad," Marcus said, crossing the room toward me with quick, uneven steps, his voice pitched low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here. You're supposed to be. How did you even?" "I was invited," I said quietly, and held up the glossy card the facility had sent me weeks earlier before anyone understood what it would mean for me to actually attend. "It says right here, family welcome." The hospital director, a warm, harried woman named Beverly Sato, approached with a bright, uncertain smile, clearly unsure what to make of a resident standing unescorted among her donors. Before she could speak, before anyone could gently steer me back toward a car and a locked hallway, the string quartet finished its piece. The lights dimmed toward the small stage at the front of the room, and Beverly was called forward to begin the evening's program. I want to tell you I had some elaborate plan for that stage, some carefully engineered moment of confrontation. I didn't. What I had was Eleanor's letter in my pocket, Diane and Detective Ibarra standing quietly near the exit, and the simple, unshakable conviction that I was done being spoken about in rooms where I wasn't allowed to speak. Beverly's introduction was warm, generous, entirely sincere in its ignorance. She spoke about devotion, about the sacrifices families make, about the particular grace of a son who visits, who advocates, who never stops fighting for his father's dignity, and Marcus climbed the 2 small steps to the stage to accept his award with the practiced, aching smile of a man performing a role he could no longer remember agreeing to play. He was 3 sentences into his acceptance speech, something about how his father had taught him everything he knew about strength. When Maya stood up from her seat near the back of the room, she hadn't planned it either. She told me later that she simply couldn't sit still one more second, listening to a man describe devotion he had spent 9 nights actively poisoning. Her chair scraped loudly against the parquet floor, sharp enough to cut through the polite murmur of the crowd, and every head in that ballroom turned to find a young woman in a plain dark dress, standing rigid among 300 people in evening wear. "I'm sorry," Maya said, her voice trembling but carrying clearly across the room. "I'm a nurse at Golden Meadows. I've cared for Mr. Hensley for the past 3 weeks. And I can't sit here and let this happen without saying something." The room's easy warmth curdled instantly into a tense, uncertain silence, not the frozen silence of the admissions lobby, but something sharper, more alive. 300 people suddenly unsure which version of the evening they were watching. Marcus's hand tightened on the award in his grip. "Maya, this isn't the place. You told him," Maya said, cutting across him, her voice gaining steadiness with every word. In front of the admissions staff, on his first day, that he couldn't remember which end of a screwdriver to hold. "I was standing 8 feet away. I heard you say it." She turned toward the crowd, toward Beverly Sato's stricken face, toward the reporter from the local paper who had gone very still with her pen hovering over her notepad. "Mr. Hensley passed an independent neuropsychological evaluation with no signs of cognitive impairment whatsoever. His medication was being tampered with inside our facility. I filed a mandated report 3 weeks ago. There's an active investigation right now into how he ended up in that building at all." The murmur that swept through the ballroom was low and disbelieving at first, and then, as the words settled, something angrier. I watched Marcus's face in that moment with the same careful attention I'd once given a lock's tumblers, watching for the exact instant a mechanism finally gives way. And I saw it happen, watched 35 years of my son collapse inward, watched the desperate performer disappear and leave behind, for one raw, unguarded second, the frightened drowning man who had let his wife's panic become his own cruelty. It was Cheryl who moved first, and not toward comfort. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp and rising, stepping forward from beside the stage with the particular ferocity of someone's protecting a lie she'd invested far more in than her husband had. "Walter has been confused for months. Everyone who's spent 5 minutes with him since Eleanor died knows that. His own wife worried herself sick over." "Don't," I said, and my voice, when it came, was quieter than Cheryl's, but it stopped her mid-sentence, the way a single drop tool can stop an entire workshop. "Don't you dare use Eleanor to cover for what you did." Something ugly flickered across Cheryl's face then, something that had been carefully hidden under 9 days of manila folders and gentle smiles, and in her fear, in the sudden collapsing of a plan she'd spent nearly a year building, she said the thing that would finally, completely, sever whatever thread of doubt still remained in that room. "Your precious Eleanor," Cheryl snapped, "spent the last year of her life obsessing over money she didn't even understand, writing paranoid little notes about a business she never once asked to see the real books of. She wasn't protecting anyone, Walter. She was a sick, frightened old woman who couldn't tell the difference between her husband's failing shop and a real threat. The room went silent in a way it hadn't for Marcus's cruelty, a silence that had weight and heat to it. 300 strangers, suddenly understanding, all at once, exactly what kind of person had been standing on that stage's edge orchestrating an old man's confinement. I felt something rise in me that had nothing to do with strategy, nothing to do with the careful patience I'd spent 5 months cultivating. It was simply grief, finally finding somewhere honest to go. "My wife," I said, and my voice carried further than I expected it to, steady in a way that surprised even me. "Restored the same delicate things I did for 40 years, only she restored people instead of clock ears. She sat with our son through 2 failed businesses without once making him feel small for it. She wrote me a letter 4 weeks before she died, worried not about her own comfort, but about what money and fear might do to the people she loved most. She was not confused. She was the only one of us paying close enough attention to see this coming. It was Marcus, still standing on the small stage with the award trembling in his hands, who broke first. Not into anger, but into something that looked, from where I stood, disturbingly like relief. "She's right," he said so quietly that Beverly had to lean toward the microphone to catch it, and then, louder, forcing the words out like a man finally setting down something impossibly heavy. "Cheryl's right that I never asked to see the real books, because I was too afraid of what I'd find. I let her handle the money because it was easier than facing how bad it had gotten. And when Brightline started calling, when they started making it clear what would happen if we didn't pay, I didn't come up with the plan to move Dad here. She did. His voice cracked, and he looked down at the award in his hands as though he'd only just noticed he was still holding it. I just let it happen. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he'd be safer here than at home alone, that it wasn't really lying, just protecting everyone. I let myself believe that because the alternative was admitting I'd let my own wife talk me into destroying my father. Cheryl's composure finally shattered entirely at that, her carefully maintained performance collapsing into something cornered and desperate. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," she hissed at him, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You're the one who needed the money. You're the one who's been drowning since the second restaurant, since before we were even married." It was Detective Ibarra, moving calmly through the parting crowd with a badge already visible at her hip, who finally interrupted the unraveling marriage playing out in front of 300 witnesses. "Cheryl Hensley," she said, her voice carrying the flat, procedural calm of someone who had done this many times before. "I have a warrant for your arrest, related to an ongoing investigation into fraudulent lending activity connected to Brightline Capital Partners and Meridian Fine Goods LLC. The gasp that moved through the ballroom then was not the frozen silence of the admissions lobby weeks earlier. It was something alive, something with heat in it. 300 donors and administrators and reporters watching a carefully constructed lie come apart in real time, piece by piece, exactly the way a well-made lock fails when every pin has finally, simultaneously, found the flaw that was always waiting inside it. I want to tell you what happened next wasn't quiet or gentle, but in truth, much of it was the practiced, procedural gentleness of professionals doing difficult work. Detective Ibarra escorted Cheryl from the ballroom with 2 uniformed officers waiting discreetly near the service entrance, sparing the room, and Marcus, and whatever remained of Lily's understanding of her mother, from a scene louder than the one that had already unfolded. A separate charge, filed the following week once the elder abuse investigation formally concluded, would name Marcus alongside her, not for the architecture of the scheme, which the evidence increasingly showed had been Cheryl's from the start, but for what the law rightly called his knowing participation in it, his signature on the guardianship petition, his silence while I was drugged in my own home. It was in the strange, quiet aftermath of Cheryl's departure, the ballroom still buzzing with shocked, half-whispered conversation, that I saw a small figure detach herself from a cluster of confused, murmuring adults near the back of the room and make her way, with the fearless directness only a child can manage, straight toward the stage. Lily was 8 years old, Still in the pale blue dress she'd clearly been dressed in for a happy family evening, and she climbed the 2 steps to where her father stood frozen, still holding an award that no longer meant anything to anyone in that room, and looked up at him with the particular clarity children carry before the world teaches them to soften their questions. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but perfectly audible in the ringing silence. "Why did you tell everyone Grandpa forgets things when you're the one who still keeps Grandma's ring in your coat pocket for good luck? You showed me. You said it helps you remember what matters." I don't think Lily understood, not fully, the size of what she'd just said. But I watched something break open in her father's face. Not the practiced collapse of a man caught, but something rawer, something that looked, for the first time in 5 months, like actual grief finally finding him instead of the fear he'd been running from. He knelt down slowly on the small stage, still in his suit, and pulled his daughter into an embrace that had nothing performed about it, his shoulders shaking in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy young enough to still believe his father could fix anything. I didn't approach him. Not then. There would be time, in the difficult months that followed, for the harder conversations, for the guilty plea he would eventually enter, for the restitution he would spend years working to repay, for the slow, uncertain rebuilding of whatever relationship 2 men can salvage after one has nearly destroyed the other. But standing at the edge of that stage, watching my son hold his daughter while the room around us slowly exhaled, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that night, underneath the anger and the vindication both, a small aching sorrow for the boy he'd once been, before pressure and fear and a partner who'd known exactly how to use both had worn him down into someone I no longer fully recognized. What happened in the days that followed unfolded with the particular quiet efficiency of institutions finally doing what they were built to do. Monday's guardianship hearing lasted considerably longer than the 11 minutes that had first taken my freedom, nearly 3 hours, in fact, during which Dr. Prasad's evaluation, Eleanor's ledger, Renata's statement, and the public financial records Diane had assembled were entered one by one into a record that would this time reflect something close to the truth. The judge terminated the guardianship immediately and, in a rare additional step, ordered a formal referral to the state's Elder Abuse Task Force. Dr. Grantham surrendered his medical license 3 weeks later rather than face a board hearing he had no realistic hope of surviving. The loan forgiveness Diane had uncovered made the outcome of that hearing something close to inevitable. Cheryl pleaded guilty, 8 months later, to multiple counts of fraud connected to both Brightline and a pattern of similar schemes targeting 2 other elderly clients the investigation eventually uncovered, and was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Marcus, in a separate proceeding, pleaded guilty to guardianship fraud and elder financial abuse, avoided prison through a plea agreement that included substantial restitution and 5 years of supervised probation, and lost, for a period of 18 months by court order, unsupervised custody of Lily. A consequence that broke something in him more thoroughly, he told me later, than any prison sentence could have. I want to be honest about the year that followed, because a story like this one is too easy to end at the moment of exposure, as though the collapse of a lie is the same thing as healing. It isn't. There were months where Marcus and I barely spoke, where the sight of him made my hands shake in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with betrayal too deep to simply forgive on schedule. There was a long, difficult evening, nearly a year after the gala, when he finally sat across from me at my own kitchen table. The house was mine again by then, every account, every asset, restored through the same court that had once so carelessly taken them, and asked me, in a voice stripped of every performance he'd once relied on, whether I thought he could ever earn back the right to be trusted with anything that mattered to me again. I didn't have a clean answer for him that night, and I won't pretend I do now. I told him the truth instead, that trust, in my experience, isn't a lock you can force open twice as fast the second time around. It has to be earned back one honest day at a time, the same slow, patient way it's built the first time, and that I was willing to let him try. But that willingness wasn't the same thing as forgiveness handed over in advance. I also owe you something I haven't said yet. something I only came to understand fully in the quiet months after the courtroom cleared and the reporters stopped calling. My own silence, in the year before Eleanor died, hadn't caused what Marcus and Cheryl did to me. But I have had to sit more than once with the uncomfortable knowledge that if I had asked my son a single direct question about his business 18 months earlier, if pride hadn't kept me from admitting that I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the new watch that didn't match his old car, some part of this might never have happened at all. A father's silence doesn't excuse a son's cruelty, but it can leave a door unlatched that a more honest conversation might have bolted shut in time, and I have made my peace, slowly, with carrying that small weight alongside everything Marcus and Cheryl chose to carry on their own. Golden Meadows Memory Care reached out to me nearly a year to the day after I first walked through its doors, not to admit me again, but to ask whether I would consider funding a modest renovation to their resident garden, the same quiet courtyard where Diane had first laid out the evidence that would eventually set me free. I said yes on one condition, and Beverly Sato, to her credit, agreed to it without hesitation. The garden reopened that spring with a small brass plaque near its entrance, one I designed and cast myself in my own workshop. The same steady hands that had once built a hidden compartment for a woman who'd trusted me with her secrets now shaping metal into something meant to be seen rather than hidden. Eleanor Hensley Memory Garden, it reads, dedicated to the residents and families of Golden Meadows, and to the quiet courage of those who look closely enough to see the truth others have stopped looking for. Maya was there for the small dedication ceremony, no longer a night shift nurse, but the facility's newly appointed director of resident advocacy, a position Beverly had created specifically for her in the aftermath of everything that had happened, built around the very instinct that had once made her pause outside an admissions desk and refuse to look away from a stranger's undeserved humiliation. I asked her, that afternoon, standing among the new flower beds with Eleanor's plaque catching the early spring light, why she'd taken such a risk for a man she'd known only 9 days. Because you didn't sound like the chart, she said again. The same answer she'd given me on the night she opened Eleanor's hidden drawer, and then added something she hadn't said before. And because I think most people who end up needing help the most are the ones everyone else has already decided aren't worth listening to closely. Lily visits me most Sundays now, old enough at 9 to ask sharper, harder questions than the one that broke her father open on that ballroom stage, and young enough still to believe, in the resilient, forgiving way children often do, that broken things can be carefully, patiently repaired. She likes to sit beside me at my workbench while I restore old clocks for customers who still remember my shop, watching the small brass gears turn beneath my hands. And last month, without my asking, she pointed at the false floor of the very workbench. Eleanor's letter had once led me back to and asked whether I could teach her how to build a hidden compartment of her own. I sit some evenings in the armchair by our bedroom window, the one that catches the 7 o'clock light every morning of the year, holding Eleanor's letter, which I keep now not hidden in any drawer but framed, openly, on the wall above the desk she loved. I think about the lesson she left me, the one about locks, only meaning something when the hand holding the key has earned your trust one honest day at a time, and I understand it now in a way I couldn't have understood it before any of this happened. The mechanisms we build to keep the people we love safe are only ever as strong as our willingness to keep checking them, gently, patiently, for the flaws that grief and fear and love itself can sometimes hide even from the person who built them. She knew that long before I did. She simply waited. In the quiet, careful way she waited for everything that mattered, until I was finally ready to hear it.